I understand that the that Neil will begin, and for about maybe a half an hour or so, he will speak to us, and then Dirk and Claudia will follow, and we look forward to their presentations. So Neil, can I hand over to you, please?
Thanks, Peter John.
Both my Zoom meetings of this morning have not been able to.
I hope you can all see my screen.
Exit.
Peter John, are you able to see the screen?
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay. So many thanks for the invitation, and it's great to see a lot of old faces and some new faces. I think that some of you might have seen that the Institute for Economic Justice has released a policy brief in which we outline, in particular, options for financing a universal basic income grant. But I thought today I wouldn't go too much in depth into the technical questions relating to the financing of the grant, but rather focus on the sort of context within which this debate is taking place, but also give some of the financing options as well. So I think there's general understanding that a universal basic income guarantee, which is now what civil society activists prefer to call it, rather than a grant, because it conveys the notion of being a citizen's right, would be universal, would be a resource transfer, a cash benefit, and something that was a guarantee to everybody. In particular, those aged 18 to 59, for reasons that I'll explain now, and that this would fulfill the constitutional mandate to provide social security to everybody. As I think most people on this call, in this webinar would know, there's a long historic demand which goes back to the 1998 Job Summit, the Basic Income Grant Coalition, which the churches were part of, together with the trade unions and civil society. But I think the COVID crisis has now put this issue seriously on the agenda. And there's a wide agreement that there needs to be a focus on the group that is currently missing from our social security system, namely those from the ages of 18 to 59, who do not have any form of state income support. And of course, the child support grant and the old age pension are in place. In the short term, those shouldn't be tinkered with. So outside of the improving the level of grants, the focus now is on extending the grant to those aged 18 to 59, which would mean de facto universal basic income, because everybody would be covered in some way or another. Of course, some people are arguing that it should be limited at this point to the unemployed. However, there is preference, broad preference in civil society for it to be universal. There's also a debate about whether it should be introduced immediately or phased in over time. In the current policy debates, two broad options are being considered for a UBIG for those aged 18 to 59. Firstly, a universal grant, which would be guaranteed, received by all, but clawed back progressively from those who don't need it through the tax system and other mechanisms. And the second option would be a targeted guarantee, but only for those who qualify on the basis of level of income, employment status, etc. And a lot of the proposals out there from the Department of Social Development and other actors are also looking at a UBIG for the unemployed. So the first meets the criteria for a UBIG, the second meets most of the criteria, but is not universal. Some of the pros and cons of these options, an unemployed grant because it would be targeted, you would be able to afford a higher amount for the beneficiaries. However, the cons include the fact that the COVID economy in particular sees a very fluid, dynamic transitioning between the employment status of formal, informal, part-time, unemployed, etc., and the conditionalities with means testing and employment status creates a number of inefficiencies and unfairness, as we've seen with the COVID special grant. It also creates a disincentive to enter the labor market and earn income, and is not necessarily created as a fundamental right, although this depends on how it is structured. Whereas a universal basic income for 18 to 59-year-olds would more effectively address poverty and inequality, because all low income, whether working or not working, but people who are living in poverty, unemployed or partially employed would receive it. The income can be transferred relatively simply and minimizes bureaucratic interference and corruption, and is a right which no one can take away. The cons, however, is the ability to finance it is highly contested, and the danger of it being set too low. So why a UBIG at this stage? Firstly, as we've indicated, there's this long-standing gap in the social security system, age 18 to 59. And this, a UBIG for this group would be an important step towards income security for all and the longer-term restructuring of our social security system. When compared to other programs of government aimed at assisting the poor, an income transfer can be rapidly implemented, as we've seen with the COVID grant. It reaches beneficiaries directly and is less prone to corruption. So even with the administrative inefficiencies and problems which SASSA has been experiencing relative to a number of other infrastructure programs, state procurement, et cetera, the level of corruption and inefficiency in these grants is less. And if it was universal, that could be further reduced. Also, the UBIG, it is argued, should be seen as an investment, not just a cost. Economic multipliers of the transfers, and we must remember here we're talking about a couple of $100 billion being put into the poorest communities and households. That would have a stimulus impact, and research which we've commissioned has shown that a UBIG at the lower bound poverty level raises economic growth by around 0.5%, and the disposable income of the lowest 2 quintiles by around 5%. The model also counterintuitively shows that it actually reduces the deficit and the debt to GDP ratios as a result of its growth impact. It reduces inequality significantly and massively reduces poverty. For example, if it was set at the lower bound poverty line, it would reduce poverty from around 37 to 30%. The social impact, as seen in the international experience, is very extensive, and I'll come back to that now. Also, it benefits carers, and we've seen in the COVID period how important the issue of care work and unremunerated care work is. Obviously, all adults will be getting this, and therefore would have a basic income floor which supported them. The research also shows that it stimulates local economies, as the poor tend to spend a greater proportion of their income and a greater proportion locally. Even with the 350 Rand, it's been argued that that very small injection has had a significant impact on local communities, and also supports the income of the working poor, who may be earning very low wages but have to support relatives and the unemployed, and stabilizes household incomes in times of crisis. And there's this interesting paper which has just been published by Wider, and I give the reference there, and we can share that with colleagues. It shows that household income decreases. Household incomes decreased by 11% in March to June 2020, but without the cash transfers that were provided by the social grants and the improvement of existing grants, as well as the new grants, they would have dropped by 25% without those new measures, which were introduced by government. The international experience shows that there is a large that large-scale income transfer programs, as we've seen in Brazil, or localized trials, as in Kenya and Namibia and so on, as Dirk and Claudia will speak about, have a wide range of social and economic benefits. And at the bottom there, I put a reference to a paper which was commissioned by Presidency, which summarizes some of these. The key, of course, is the reduction in poverty, but in addition, there's a wider range of benefits, including support for nutrition and health, increased school attendance, the support for job seeking, stimulus to local economies, and helping mitigate getting into excessive debt, as well as assisting agriculture and informal businesses. These are some of the international evidence around extensive income support. Clearly, this slide is incomplete, but clearly a UBIG by itself is not a panacea. It needs to be combined with other social and economic instruments to ensure development. And clearly here, the question of macroeconomic interventions, as well as diversification of the economy, industrialization, must accompany something like universal income support in order to have the desired effects. In relation to COVID and the big, I think many of the people in this webinar would be familiar with the fact that COVID has had devastating employment impacts, caused widespread hunger and humanitarian and economic crisis. In essence, 1.4 million jobs have been lost net between December 2019 and December 2020, and we're still waiting for the quarterly labor force survey results from the first quarter of this year. But initial reports are not encouraging. It's affecting in particular women, low income, low skilled, they're already vulnerable. Food insecurity is high. So government protection measures have helped, but many have been suspended or about to be terminated. In particular, as we sit here, the big controversy raging in the country is the intention to end the COVID grant at the end of April. And the argument of the Institute for Economic Justice is that there can be no economic recovery without rescue measures which stabilize households, businesses, those hardest hit by the crisis. To have economic recovery, you need to rebuild and rescue those who are facing this very deep economic crisis currently. So the argument is that measures should continue and be improved until the UBIG can be implemented. And then in particular, the COVID grant extended until next year, increased to the food poverty line at least 585 Rand. And caregivers who are currently excluded from the COVID grant, the 7 million who are receiving the caregivers grant, must qualify to receive it. This graph simply shows that the caregivers grant and the COVID grant actually rescued around about 6 million people from food poverty. The importance of maintaining the SRD and the caregivers allowance is demonstrated by that, and this table just shows what the cost of extending the COVID grant would be, and the extension of the caregivers allowance. In relation to the proposals that are out there around a UBIG, we canvass those in the IEJ policy brief. We identify the fact that there are problems with the proposals that are out there. Although there's some very valuable inputs that have been made by DSD, by the Black Sash, by the ANC, and a number of other actors in society who have put proposals on the table. The one is that the phased proposal involved complex processes of targeting that may make implementation more cumbersome. Tax proposals are not quantified and are sometimes aggressive, and lack of firm recommendations. So we aim to, as the IEJ, enrich this by addressing some of the gaps. and have attempted to answer these questions. Who gets it? How much should it be? How much will it cost? How will we pay for it? And the impact. So there are various options in terms of means testing, as we've indicated, but if all people aged 18 to 59 receive it, then it's not dependent on any means testing or criteria. But in the costing that we've done, we've assumed that there will not be 100% uptake, because based on existing evidence and experience, there is initially around about 60% uptake, even if the UBIG is available to everybody. We've used the category of not formally employed because it's difficult to distinguish between informal sector workers, the unemployed, and not economically active. So you'll see in the tables that we've used to calculate the cost of these different options, we've rather used that category. In terms of how much it should be, the poverty lines have been used generally as reference point, the food poverty line, low bound poverty line, and the upper bound poverty line, and you see the figures there. Of course, those prices have increased since last year. And we've also included in our calculations 2,500 and 3,500 as, in terms of assessing the cost and the financing options. And that table, which is in the policy brief, outlines these various options from extending it to all, as you'll see in the top left-hand corner there, to extending it to the not formally employed right at the bottom. And you can see the costs if you go across there for the food poverty line, the lower bound poverty line, upper bound poverty line, etc. Assuming that only 80% or 60% take up the grant, then you can see, for example, that the food poverty line, if 60% of eligible people, if it was extended to all, took it up, it would cost 144 billion rand a year, or 206 billion rand a year for the lower bound poverty line, etc. The financing options that we have looked at assume that we may have to borrow small amounts initially, and as the impact of the grants kicked in, and as one was beginning to reap the benefits of the implementation of the grant through through VAT, through other sort of multiply effects of the grant, you would need to progressively over time borrow less and be able to finance it more from revenue. The mix of taxation policies that we've included are aimed at recouping the big from those with taxable income and taxing those with middle, high, and high incomes on a sliding scale, taxing wealth and income from wealth, limiting tax breaks for those with high incomes, cancelling ineffective corporate tax breaks, taxing environmentally damaging behavior, wasteful and irregular expenditure being reduced, and reducing tax evasion. And this basket of measures can be achieved with the necessary political will. So we calculate through the research that we've done over the last 6 to 9 months that at least 158 billion is immediately available with minor tax regime changes. Of this, 64.7 billion would be available via social security tax, which I'll explain now, and then 93 odd billion would be available via 11 other identified financing measures, which are contained in a table which I'll put up just now. And an estimated 34 to 189 billion available through a wealth tax. That is more medium-term measure, which would have to be rolled out over sort of 3 to 5 years. Between 12 to 13.5% of the total cost would be recouped through spending on the vatable items. It may be difficult to see there, but this is the range of 12 financing options that we have suggested, from the social security tax to tweaking existing tax measures to introducing new measures and seeking greater efficiency. There's a proposal for a luxury VAT of 25% on selected items. You can go through that. In addition to that, what we've done is the IEJ has commissioned independent economists to stress test our financing proposals in terms of their viability, their efficacy and progressivity, as well as to look at other possible financing options. Additional financing options they're exploring together with ourselves include financial transactions tax, a resource rent tax, which taxes super profits in resource areas, a withholding tax on government contracts, which would have the double impact of companies doing business with government having to become much more transparent in relation to their business, so it would have a dual effect of helping to combat corruption, tax on super profits, and the wealth taxes, as mentioned before. One of the big innovations which we propose is a social security tax, which is a progressive tax on income, but instead of doing it through the income tax brackets, it would be a dedicated tax, like the UIF is, where employers and workers would contribute based on the level of income. So if you look at the table, those earning 0 to 80,000 Rand a year would only contribute 1.5% of income. Those earning 80 to 350 would contribute 2%, et cetera, progressively clawing back. And so you can see that those earning 350,000 to 1 million would contribute effectively, if you look in column the two columns from the end, 25.5 billion to the grant. The advantage of this is that low-income earners would both get the grant, but also contribute to the grant. And if you look on the next slide, you can see that those cells or the rows in yellow indicate where lower-income earners, even after they've made their contribution via the social security tax, would still be benefiting those amounts from the UBI. So for example, if the UBI was 585 Rand in that bottom row, then those earning 70,000 would get back around 6,000 Rand from the UBI after contributions. If the benefit was 840 Rand, those earning 35,000 would get about 10,000 back after contributions. And it's only those earning 500,000 and above who would be being net contributors to the grant. So that's integrating or incorporating the notion of progressivity in the way that the social security tax is structured, but also ensuring that everybody earns an income, contributes. The wealth tax, as I indicated, it would depend, the various options from 1 to 3%. It would take a long time to collect the wealth data, but that table shows what one could recoup from these various options in terms of different levels of tax on the top 1% or the top 0.1%. And that's something that economists are working on further at the moment. In relation to VAT collection, remembering, of course, that most of the UBIG will be spent. And so, we estimate that about 80% of these items will be VATable, and that what is recouped by government from VAT will finance approximately 12% of the total cost of a UBIG. So in terms of what is possible with that 158 billion in additional tax revenue, either we indicate that all could benefit from a UBI, assuming a 60% uptake initially at the food poverty line of 585 Rand, or all 18 to 59, assuming a 60% uptake at an upper bound poverty line of at a lower bound poverty line with some borrowing that's not included in this table, or all those formerly employed at a food poverty line of 585. With the additional taxes from the wealth tax, we can see there what could be done. So our recommendations are that the COVID grant is extended until the end of the current financial year, as I indicated, an increase to the food poverty line of 585. We had initially proposed extending the caregivers allowance, but are now saying that this can be incorporated into the COVID grant because it'd be basically the same amount. We just need to ensure that the caregivers qualify for the grant and not disqualified as they are currently for receiving the child support grant. In the short term, implement a UBIG at the food poverty line of 585 Rand a month. And in the medium term, implement a wealth tax to increase to the lower bound or upper bound poverty line, depending on uptake. And in the longer term, would need to engage in a process of consultation and long-term planning to ensure UBIG sufficient to meet basic needs, but also to transform the social security system in its entirety. And clearly, UBIG is not going to happen by itself. It's going to involve massive social contestation. We've seen today there are pickets happening and marches to government to demand the extension of the COVID grant. One thing that is interesting about the UBIG is that there's very broad support from it, both from the left and the right of the social spectrum. And in fact, in the committee debate in Parliament, all political parties, including the governing party, supported the introduction of UBIG in the recent parliamentary debate. Department of Social Development has put out a discussion paper on this. The President has spoken on a number of occasions about, in principle, supporting the introduction of the UBIG. The ANC Social Transformation and Economic Transformation Committees are currently finalizing recommendations to the ANC National Executive Committee on the introduction of a UBIG. Trade unions supported, civil society supported, but of course, there are powerful support forces which will oppose it. And one of the biggest obstacles currently is the dogma or the ideology of austerity, which advances the view that there has to be massive cutbacks in public expenditure to meet debt obligations, et cetera, which we believe is counterproductive and in fact will push us deeper into a downward spiral. So I'll leave it at that. Peter John, sorry that was a bit long. There's some additional issues, but I'll deal with those in question time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. That was an incredibly insightful and comprehensive overview of the numerous issues involved in the discussion of UBIG. I'm very grateful for that, and I know there'd be many questions, even at the level of just clarity, and I'm cautious about opening that possibility now, even though those questions are obviously fresh in people's minds, because I think it's going to use a phrase you used, claw away at the time of our next presenters. So I'm going to ask that you just make a note of the questions you want to raise, also those of clarification, and I'm going to hand over to Dirk and to Claudia Haarmann to speak to us from their extensive research here in earlier years, but now also in Namibia, and I know across the SADC region as well. So Claude and Dirk, it's wonderful to have you, and we look forward to your contribution.
Thank you very much, Peter John, yes, for inviting us to this presentation. Thank you, Neil, for this very engaged and really insightful presentation from your side. A brief disclaimer from our side, because we were able to get our COVID vaccination yesterday. We got a spot on a very short notice. And this is obviously good news for us, but the bad news is we are slightly drugged, and Claudia doesn't feel so well today. So I will present the joint presentation, and then Claudia can come in a little later in the discussion, but we prepared that presentation together. We have structured this presentation in 5 parts. The first part, we want to look at comprehensive social protection through a UBI in times of COVID. I want then to go to the practical examples from the Basic Income Grant pilot project in Ochivero. First, to look at how was the situation like before the pilot was implemented. We'll do this with a diagram called Too Little, Too Late. And then introduce the Basic Income Grant pilot from Ochivero. What were the conditions there? And what were the results, most importantly, the Basic Income Grant, the big picture. Again, we'll try to use a diagram to illustrate and to put bits and pieces together. And then finally, we want to conclude why we believe that the UBI is a viable economic recovery program. I think there has been a shift from a welfare program to seeing really UBI as a precondition for economic recovery, especially in Southern Africa. So let me start why we think a comprehensive social protection system in form of a UBI is especially now important. There has been the debate about targeting versus universal, and maybe we can go into that in detail in the discussion. But I think for now, COVID has exposed that there are social and economic problems of selective targeting. And there is a new concept of safety and vulnerability, which has emerged with the COVID pandemic. Also, the notion of physical space has changed if one looks, for example, at America. And therefore, COVID-19 now requires a comprehensive coverage, an easy administration, a rights-based approach, and it needs to be crisis-proof. So therefore, we believe that a UBI forms an integral part of a healthy society and is crucial for economic recovery. This is the first diagram where we try to explain what the situation looked like, what was the picture of the economy in Ochivero before the pilot started. So this is a picture which is all too familiar in Southern Africa, an economy which works like the Wild West. You have some cowboys with herds of cows which overgraze an undernourished soil, with the grass, which symbolizes here the people on the bottom suffering. It is a me-first economy where the huge Basan cows get fed by overeating everything from flowers to grass to its roots, leaving a scorched soil behind. And this was very much the picture in 2007, before the Basic Income Grant was introduced in Ochivero. There was a farmer who owned the only store. And here you see Hardy Köhler, not necessarily a mighty cowboy, but somebody who, through his monopoly situation, was able to exploit the people of the Ochivero village through overpriced goods, excessive debts, and so on. For all the other people, there was too little, too late, the money left in the community, and no possibility to enter the market. So you have the cows, the people symbolized through the grass in the diagram, then have too little. There's some trickling down effect, yes, when one of the cows lets off some dung, but it is hard to live on so little, even for tough grass, I might say. More often, mushrooms eat the dung. The shebeens in the community are what you see as a result. And then, let me I just need to change my screen here. And so what happened then in terms of social protection? Yes, there was also social protection before in Namibia, and especially the universal old age pension, similar to South Africa, but really universal. And therefore, families had something. But let us look at how that looked like for a family in Otjivero. And this is a quote I want to read from Wilhelmina Gavisis. She said in 2007, "I and my 3 children depend on my parents for food and accommodation. Sometimes I wish I was dead because I cannot stand this type of life anymore. I'm supposed to provide and protect my children and parents, but I'm failing to do that." As you can see, this system, too little, too late, is built on fear, on complete dependency, on the farmer, the cow, on the parents with the old age pensions. And just one last example of how it looked like in Otjivero before the basic income grant. Here you see Aaron Swartz, also a pensioner. He lived with 18 people in this tent. His family, too little, too late. Not even the most basics for most people, for most of the people in Otjivero. And this is what the economy looks like currently, and with COVID even worse. So then was the basic income grant pilot project, which was run from 2008 to 2009. And just to put it in context, the debate had started, as Neil already alluded to, with COSATU in 1997, 1998 in South Africa. And then the Namibian debate basically picked it up where South Africa left it in 2000, with a NAMTAX commission, government tax commission, proposing a basic income grant in Namibia. Then the UBIG Coalition 2005 starting to pick it up and demand a basic income grant. Then the pilot project in 2008 to 2009. To quote Nelson Mandela, "It always seems impossible until it is done." So this is why the coalition in Namibia embarked on this pilot. And what we said at the time is we'll introduce it for 2 years because it was financed through collections. Inside Namibia and outside. Everybody got $100 Namibian per person per month, which would equate now about 250 to 300 rand, given inflation since then. Universal from 0 to 59, because from 60, the universal old age pension kicked in. And no additional interventions, no conditions, no training, just giving the money to the community. And this was in a community, Otjivero, a settlement of 1,000 people, so really a small village. This was accompanied with comprehensive research and an international reference group which checked on the research done and the results which we gained. And yet, there was a lot of opposition to this very small project. Internally and internationally, just the idea of paying $100 Namibian equals rent, about 13 euro unconditionally. I remember clearly one morning in Windhoek, Claudia got a phone call from Washington. A renowned World Bank researcher called and said, and she asked, "We in Washington hear so much about Otjivero. Are you seriously giving out money unconditionally to poor people?" The World Bank in Washington was concerned about the small village of 1,000 people in remote Namibia, where everybody got 13 euro a month for 2 years. And at that moment, really, we felt like being in an Asterix and Obelix cartoon. So let us have a look at what happens when poor people get money unconditional. And this is the diagram where we want to explain what has happened in Otjivero with the basic income grant. The big picture here shows the economy can work differently. The cowboy market system is not a God-given economy system. And in order to achieve this, a BIG can play an important role to have a system which is sustainable and to have an economic money cycle. In this diagram, we again try to illustrate that the BIG what the BIG did by comparing the economy in Otjivero with an ecological cycle. So the money cycle referring to this ecological cycle. Let me briefly explain. Here above the soil, you see on the left, the BIG, the basic income grant. The little money becomes a lot for people living in poverty. And the BIG becomes less the more you move up, because there is a solidarity tax and because of the financing. So you see here on the right, the taxes are higher on the top and lower at the bottom. So the question which Hage Geingob, the president of Namibia, still poses to the Basic Income Grant Coalition in Namibia still today is, why do people get the basic income grant even if they are rich? They don't get it. They qualify first because it's universal, but they pay back, as Neil explained, much more through the tax system. So in net, they are net payers and not gaining. So you have the cycle here, the basic income grant effective at the lower end and the taxes higher on the top end, and redistributing from the rich to the poor. And what we found is that this little money circulated in the community, and I will come to examples in just a minute, but it changed the life far beyond that. Like little nutrients, and you see this here below the soil, the basic income grant penetrated deep into the social fabric. First of all, maybe in the more obvious, but still for us dramatic finding in terms of food and the effects on malnutrition. So here you see the in green, the Z-scores of the weight for age distribution of children under 5 years. The green one is the normal distribution, which the WHO would expect anywhere in the world with a healthy society. And the red line here tells you the results or what the finding from the clinic were in 2007, so before the basic income grant was paid out, meaning 42%, so everything below the -2 here, all of those children were malnourished. And this dramatically changed. 6 months after, you have the blue line here, malnutrition down to 17%, and then here, this line here, after 1 year, malnutrition was reduced to 10%. So what else people did with the money? First of all, they prioritized spending it on the children, and that should actually be a finding enough to introduce a basic income grant, but more happened. So let's look at education. Right from the beginning, small creches were started. You can see that here in this picture here on the right top. And here parents were often for the first time with the basic income grant able to pay for school fees. And they prioritized to pay for their education of their children. They queued there for these 2 days and were paying their school fees. And a lot changed within the school. The school was transformed. The teacher said, for the first time, we feel that we are actually in an actual school. Children did not only come for the school feeding, but they had eaten before they came. And hence they were able to concentrate and stay up until the end of the day. And you could measure that in the school passing rate reaching 100% after 1 year. So we have looked at food, nutrition, education. Let's have a look at health. And here is one story. Here you see the picture of Johannes Gwagosep. Johannes lived together with his frail parents and his child. His partner had died of an HIV-related illness, and he himself had developed HIV. Then the local nurse had gotten him a place in the antiretroviral program of the government clinic in Gobabis. However, the clinic in Gobabis is about 100 kilometers away from Ochivero. So Johannes, what he did, he trespassed onto an adjacent farm. He hunted a warthog. He was caught by the farmer, and the farmer handed him over to the police. And when I saw Johannes for the first time, that was here in the picture on the right top, I visited him in prison. Johannes' crime was to try to get transport money for him to access his life-saving medicine. This really criminalized him. And if that was not bad enough, in prison, he did not receive the antiretroviral treatment, so he developed TB and he got weaker. Then the basic income grant started. The family put together their money and were able to pay the bail, got Johannes out of the prison. And then Johannes was able to travel with the big money to the clinic, got his ARVs, and they worked also because he had food to eat. He became healthy again, as you can see him here in this picture. In the left, he could take care of the family with a big. The family bought food and they rebuilt even parts of their house. But sadly, when I tried to visit Johannes in 2019, he had passed on. What had happened? In 2009, the basic income grant was reduced and then 2 years later stopped completely. And Johannes had passed on. His brother is now taking care of his child. His brother told me how the food in the house became scarce after the basic income grant stopped. And Johannes started to drink self-brewed beer, also to have something in the stomach to take his medicines. But with alcohol, the medicines did not work. He became weaker and weaker, and so he passed on. We had food, education, health, but the basic income grant money really changed even more substantially lower in the down, penetrating into the earth far below. And I want to speak to the political voice which the community gained. That's the wrong one. Through the basic income grant. With the BIG, the people themselves, the community themselves, not the Basic Income Grant Coalition, they decided and said, we want to talk about our experience. We want to talk to community people, but also to political leaders. And this is what this poor community did. They actually went in front of the cameras, national and international press, and told their story. And their message was, and that's a quote, they said, the basic income grant is not only something for Ochivero, but it should uplift Namibia, then Africa, and at last, the world. So what changed economically. And I just want to sum up 3 short case studies, what happened economically. The first one is here. It's maybe a small beginning, but it's something. Let us look at Sella and Alfred Nusep in 2008 with a basic income grant. They did not become rich with a big, but they started a small shop. They bought in bulk and sold to other people. Very simple, straightforward. But in economic terms, this was very meaningful because it crushed the monopoly of the only shop, the farm shop in Ochevero. And so prices went down and people could buy much more with the money they had from the basic income grant or old age pensions or the meager salaries they earned. And in addition, Alfred made bridles for donkey carts. This was reflected in the overall statistics. The average monthly per capita income without the basic income grant, so not including the basic income grant in that calculations, rose by an average of 30% in 1 year. This shows that people were able to realize an increase in their incomes beyond the values of the basic income grant. So far from a basic income grant making people lazy, it enabled them rather instead to become economic active, and the money cycle was working in the community, and a considerable amount of the money stayed first in the community, boosting local economic growth. And even in 2019, Sella and Alfred still showed what they bought with the big money and what they had achieved with their small business. So these might be small beginnings. Let's look at something a little bit bigger. Here you see Joseph Ganep. Joseph used the big money to buy cement and to produce bricks. His brick business turned out to be so good that the farmers around Ochevero did no longer go to Windhoek to buy the bricks there, but they bought bricks now from him since they were cheaper there and since the farmer said they were of better quality than what they got in Windhoek. So his business went very well. But when I visited him in 2019, so again, 10 years after the basic income grant, he told me that the farmer next to Ochevero wanted to buy his business now. And Joseph said he had cash problems since people often bought on debt, and therefore he couldn't buy cement because with debt you can't purchase anything. And therefore he was now left in a catch-22 situation, thinking about selling his business to the farmer adjacent. He would still be working there because the farmer wanted to employ him, but then he would be an employee and he would no longer be an employer. So you see, some people made a small living, others even managed to employ people, and there were also people who really made it. This is Frida Mboya. You see here on her check, she wrote just after the basic income grant was introduced, "Good life after struggle." The basic income grant enabled Frida to work on her dream to build a bakery. She started baking rolls and selling them to the community, first by selling them, or she sold them for $1 Namibian, baking over the fire. After a few months, she bought a small oven and started to bake rolls and in addition, bread. The business continued to grow. She applied for support from the government, could buy a gas stove and bake more rolls and more bread. And I think 2 things are important here. Firstly, she had the security to see the grant, whatever happened, whether she was able to sell her rolls or not. If she earned money, good for her. If she failed to make a profit, she could still rely on the grant to come in the next month and her children wouldn't go hungry. If the grant would have been cut the moment she made a profit, she would have lost the security and would not have been able to take the risk to try and invest. And this goes to the very core of why the grant needs to be universal and not means tested. The question for me is, why would you want to punish people when they try to improve the situation? And the same holds not only for means testing, but for employment testing. Because should they lose a benefit the moment they find a job, especially given the often short-term temporary jobs people get in the beginning, this would mean that they would have to move out and in the system. Secondly, the economic point, without the consistent buying power in the community, a business like the one from Frida would not have been able to grow. So here, Frida in 2019, she has managed to build a stone house, a stone bakery with a fully fledged industrial baking machine with her own sign, but she says she's still selling the rolls for $1 Namibian each, because she says otherwise the people in Otjivero will not be able to afford the rolls. Let me sum up. So building local economic growth, what is important for this? What are the key takeaways? In order to redistribute money from the rich to the poor, a basic income needs to be universal, as Neil just had explained, because you need to recuperate the money from the rich, and you need financing options which then goes beyond the recuperation, which redistributes from the rich to the poor. And the problem is, if you have targeted programs, you also have the working poor who might be hit by increases in taxation, especially if you have to increase value-added tax. They would, in the end, then with a targeted grant, be worse off than before, because they need to finance this targeted grant. With the universal grant, you can structure it exactly as Neil explained it, that those in the bottom, whether they are in employment or without employment, and even the working poor, would still get more than they are paying back. So you have a progressive scale, which only works if it's universal. Then you have much more potential to redistribute and to finance and really get local economic growth going. And that's the move from a welfare system to an economic recovery plan, which needs much more resources than just a traditional welfare program. So that's key. And for the people, you need to avoid perverse incentives, the poverty traps. You shouldn't punish economic activity. So the moment they start to be able to produce something, they shouldn't be taken off, because otherwise you have these poverty traps. Instead, people need security for the beneficiaries to become active and to be able to take risks. If we talk about the rich, we always think that they need first the support to start businesses. Why not among the poor? So revive and sustain local economic activities and see to it that you have a money cycle. The money can circulate in the community. Just a key takeaway: don't punish economic activity through targeting mechanisms, and even a low-level regular income support gives the security and enables economic development. And this is also what the people in Otjivero said: rather a low income support, which is given to everybody, than a higher amount just to a few. And therefore, it also becomes financially viable. One last thought on COVID-19. COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. The importance of a comprehensive social protection system is, I think, by now acknowledged. This is the decisive moment, and this implies chances and also risks. As I said, there's a new concept of vulnerability. Many more people are now vulnerable than they were considered before. But on the positive side, maybe also more of a genuine solidarity. The economic system is changing, so let us use this to our advantage. Economic justice and redistribution has to be a debate about priorities. The basic income grant is no longer the odd one out, but is internationally recognized, and big type policies are already implemented, like the COVID grant in South Africa or in Namibia. The challenges also need to be recognized. I think one needs to be careful. Economic rescue packages can well be regressive, and so one needs to look at it. And debt determines future options, and therefore ultimately a universal basic income grant needs to be embedded in a money cycle from within the local economy and not financed through debt. And time is of essence. This is the decisive moment, and if this moment is missed, it might really be too late. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dirk, and thank you, Claudia, for your contribution. Really insightful and very stimulating. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Kenny, to whom we are very grateful for putting this webinar together. And he's going to recognize hands and people who are wishing to speak. We have about 25 minutes left. So I'm going to ask, without trying to detract from your contributions, that you keep it as short as is possible while still getting your point across. I'm going to ask that we take questions of clarity, but also your contributions, remembering that this is an ongoing discussion. So Kenny, can I hand over to you to recognize those people who wish to participate now? But again, to our speakers, thank you so much for incredibly interesting contributions. Kenny, it's over to you.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you, Dirk and Neil, for your comprehensive presentations. If you like to ask a question, make a comment, you can either just drop me a hint in the chat, raise your hand, or whichever way is easier for you. Questions, comments? Okay, maybe the presentations were so comprehensive that we don't actually need any questions or comments. Let me just ask. I've got one there. Carissa, you can go ahead.
Hi, Kenny. I just a small question to Neil. I wanted to ask about the company tax. I see you didn't note anything about company tax. I was just wondering if it's possible to maybe increase company tax for higher companies. But I mean, I know that the overall tax, wealth tax, it's probably better. But I just wanted to know what your thoughts about the company tax. Thanks.
Hi, Neil. Before you answer, can we maybe have take another question or two? If not, you can go ahead. Go ahead, Neil.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Carissa, is it? Yeah, I think that the question of corporate tax, particularly in a depression, is a difficult one. I mean, as we've seen, Treasury has just taken, if you like, the extra tax fiscal space that was gained through additional tax revenue and given it away in the form of lowering of company tax. Now, we don't think that that is a good idea, But on the other hand, to push for an increase in company tax may not be the best route to go, because what happens is that the large corporations tend to pay a lower effective company tax rate. And it's the smaller companies that pay the effective tax rate. So that may not be the route to go, particularly in a time of economic crisis. But there are elements of the tax proposals which would be aimed at companies making either, there's the issue of super profits, the resource rent tax, which is aimed at, for example, the platinum companies that are making large gains in a time of crisis, and so on and so forth. So there are aspects of company tax and making company tax more effective, closing loopholes that need to be addressed. So I don't know if you've seen that one of Joe Biden's interventions is to propose a minimum effective tax rate globally, which basically means that after all the loopholes have been closed, you can't pay below a certain level of tax. So I think that is the sort of thinking that's required. And even the British government has indicated its intention to raise the level of tax on the most profitable companies. So instead of a blunt instrument approach, probably a more nuanced approach is required to this question of company tax. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thanks, Neil. I see that we've got a question in the chat box from Philemon. Philemon says that Philemon, do you want to ask your question yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions that I want to ask. The first one is the one on the chat box, and then the second one is that, are we not creating a dependency syndrome in South Africa, where we see from the child grant support to the unemployment BIG grant to the old age? So it seems as if from birth, one would be able to be receiving a particular grant up until one dies. What developmental approach are we going to employ in making sure that people move away from this universal basic income grant?
Before you answer, Neil, Philemon also asked in the chat box about how the UBIG will impact graduates. Neil?
Sure. Why don't we give Dirk an opportunity to respond, because I think the Namibian experience is so interesting in relation to, did it create greater dependency in those villages, or did it create greater independence?
Yes. And if you were to speak to the people in Otjivero, they would clearly state this being in the precarious situation they were before the basic income grant, that is dependency. So this extreme poverty, that's the most severe form of dependency.